The waiting room smelled like lavender and something underneath it that didn't have a name yet. Maya sat in a chair that was too comfortable, the kind designed to make you forget you were waiting, and watched the other people around her do the same thing she was doing, trying not to look at their own arms. There were 9 of them, 8 women, 1 man, all between 25 and 40, all wearing the short sleeves the clinic had requested in the pre-appointment reminder, all holding their forearms slightly away from their bodies, the way you do when you're aware of something precious and breakable. Which was funny, Maya thought, because they weren't protecting anything yet. The arms were still just arms. Avereth sat behind the reception desk. It was smaller than the ones on the broadcast footage, barely taller than a human child, with the mottled amber coloring that Maya associated with the Accord delegation, and not the shock troops that had come before. Its face was mostly eyes, wide, dark, multifaceted, and absolutely unreadable in the way of things that did not need expressions to communicate. It wore the crumb-colored uniform of the Integration Authority, the little silver circuit logo on its breast pocket catching the light each time it moved. Its hands, when it tapped at the appointment terminal, were very still, 7 fingers on each, patient in the way of something that could wait a very long time. Maya Ose, it said, not a question. Its voice came from somewhere in its torso, a low, careful sound like a radio signal being translated in real time. Maya stood up, chair side behind her. She'd rehearsed this part. The walk to the counter, the smile. The casual way she'd hold out her left arm because she'd been told. It didn't matter which arm, but she'd decided on left because she was right-handed. And she didn't know why that felt like keeping something in reserve. She'd rehearsed, not looking at the receptionist's hands. She did all of it perfectly, and it still felt like walking to the edge of something. Room 3, the Vereth said. It handed her a small card, paper, actual paper, which struck her as an odd choice for an organization that was about to wire electronics into her skin. The technician will explain the process. You should not feel significant pain. Not significant. She took the card. Her fingers didn't shake. The room was white and very clean. There was a padded chair in the center of it, wide and reclined like a dentist's chair. Beside it, a low table bearing instruments Maya didn't look at directly. The walls held a single piece of art. A photograph of a forest at dawn, between the trees, the light, coming through at that particular angle, that makes everything look like it's about to be explained. Evelyn was already in the room. She was human. That was the first thing Maya registered, and she hated herself slightly for the relief of it. Evelyn was maybe 40, with the kind of careful composure that could have meant anything. Professional training, personal history both. She wore the Integration Authority uniform too, but on her it sat differently, worn in like a second skin. Maya. She said it the way you say a name when you've read it enough times that it's become familiar. How are you feeling? Fine, Maya said. Good. Sit down, not unkind. Just direct in the way of someone who had done this many times and understood that small talk made it worse. Maya sat. The chair accepted her weight, with a quietness that felt deliberate. Evelyn began preparing the equipment, and Maya looked at the forest photograph instead of watching her. The fog in it moved slightly, a screen, not a print. She watched the light shift through the trees and thought about what her mother had said when Maya told her about the appointment. Mother was 61 and remembered the arrival, remembered the first broadcast, remembered the 7 months of silence afterward, when every government on Earth made decisions without consulting anyone who would actually live with the consequences. Her mother had looked at Maya across the kitchen table and said, "You don't have to." And Maya had said, "I know." And that had been true and also not the whole truth, because the whole truth was that bonding was voluntary in the way that most things are. Voluntary when the alternative is to watch everyone around you become more connected to the infrastructure of daily life and to find yourself increasingly outside of it. Voluntary in the way of a tide. 700 million people had already been bonded. The number was in every headline. The Integration Authority released the statistics monthly. Participation rates, network stability, reduced crime in bonded zones, proved emergency response times, enhanced individual security. The language was always about security. What the bond gave you was security. What it gave them was something the authority didn't put in the brochures. Maya knew this. She had known this before she made the appointment. She was here anyway, because knowing a thing and being able to act against it are two different skills, and she had only fully developed one of them. "I'm going to clean the application site first," Evelyn said. Left forearm as requested. The cool swab of the antiseptic. The unremarkable smell of it. "The process takes approximately 12 minutes, Evelyn said. "The circuit lattice is applied in 3 passes. You'll feel warmth during the second pass. That's normal. That's the thermal bonding. After the third pass, there will be a calibration period of about 40 seconds. Some people describe it as a kind of pressure. Behind the eyes. It passes quickly, and then you'll be connected." Evelyn said it with neither enthusiasm nor apology. Just a fact. "You'll be able to access the integration network, control linked devices, contribute your biometric data to the Community Health Index." She paused. "And they'll be able to reach you." "That's in the literature," Maya said. "Yes." Evelyn looked at her steadily. "It is." There was something in that look. Maya cataloged it and filed it away. The first pass of the applicator was cool. A fine tracing along her inner forearm, following the line of the vein, a sensation like someone drawing on her skin with a very precise finger. She watched it happen. The circuit lattice was invisible at this stage, the conductive filaments thinner than a human hair, settling into the outermost layer of her dermis and beginning the protein bonding process that make them within 6 hours, essentially indistinguishable from her own tissue. That was the part that had kept her awake the night before. Not the signal, the permanence. The second pass brought the warmth. It started at her wrist and moved toward her elbow in a slow wave, and it was not painful. It was almost pleasant, in the way that things can be pleasant and still feel fundamentally wrong, like sunburn from the inside. She watched the faint luminescence trace across her skin and thought, this is the moment she would remember later, one way or another. Either this would be nothing, the routine upgrade of 750 million people, the smooth onboarding into a connected future. Or this was the moment she let something in that she could never fully let back out. She watched the light under her skin and hummed. It was involuntary, mostly, a bar and a half of something her mother used to sing, an old gospel tune with a rhythm that felt like a heartbeat. She wasn't aware she was doing it until she caught Evelyn watching her, and she stopped. "Sorry," she said. Evelyn shook her head. "Don't be." The third pass. The pressure Evelyn had described as being behind the eyes was not behind the eyes. It was everywhere. A full-body signal that hit like a tuning fork, struck against bone, resonant and deep and total. Maya gripped the arms of the chair, and the chair let her, and the room went very white for a moment that lasted nowhere near as long as it felt like. It lasted, and then she heard them, not voices, not language exactly, more like the awareness of voices. The presence of enormous thought, arranged in a structure her mind didn't have the architecture to read, like standing in a library, where every book is in a language you can't quite place, the words almost familiar, the meaning just outside the edge of comprehension. She heard 700 million human nervous systems threaded together into something that, thought in frequency she had no name for. And behind that, steady and patient and cold as deep space, the Vareth network. She understood, in that moment, what the bond was for. Not security, not connection, not the Community Health Index or the improved emergency response times. Those were real. She could feel them, the genuine usefulness of the system, the way it could be what it said it was, while simultaneously being something else entirely. The bond was a listening post. Every bonded human was a node in a surveillance architecture of almost incomprehensible scale, feeding sensory data and emotional state and location and biological vital signs back to a network that had been mapping the human species, one person at a time, for 3 years. The Vareth were patient in the way of something that had done this before. Maya sat in the padded chair, and she understood all of this in the 40 seconds of calibration. And she did not move, and she did not scream, and she kept her face exactly as blank as she'd kept it in the waiting room. Because she understood one more thing too, in those 40 seconds. They were listening now. They had always been listening, via the already bonded. But now she was a node, she was in the system. And, if she understood what had just happened, then they would know she understood. And that was a different kind of situation entirely. She let the 40 seconds pass. She felt the pressure recede. She took a breath. "How are you feeling?" Evelyn asked. "Connected," Maya said. She watched Evelyn's face carefully. Something moved behind the technician's eyes. Something that wasn't surprise. "You knew." It wasn't a question. Evelyn held her gaze for a long moment. "Yes," she said. "Since the beginning. Since before the beginning." Maya looked down at her arm. The circuit lattice had gone dormant, invisible now, a ghost in her skin, a thread, running from her nervous system into the largest intelligence-gathering operation in the recorded history of two species. She looked at the forest photograph on the wall, the fog between the trees, the light coming through, and she thought about the 40 seconds of calibration and what she'd felt in them. She'd felt 700 million people, their rhythms, their sleeping and waking, their grief and their daily meals, and their long commutes and their small jokes, and the way each of them breathed, differently in different weather. She'd felt the Verith network reading them like a text, processing, categorizing, building a model of humanity so complete and precise that prediction became trivial. And she'd felt something else. Something the Verith network was, certainly not accounting for. 700 million humans, connected to each other through a medium designed for surveillance, begun, unconsciously, collectively, without coordination, to do what humans do when they're in close proximity to each other for a long time. They'd started to talk, not in language, not in anything the Verith had coded for, in the way of bodies that share a nervous system, the way a mother knows her child's cry in a crowded room, the way soldiers who've shared a foxhole finish each other's sentences, the way musicians who've played together long enough begin to anticipate. The bond had been designed to let the Verith read humanity. But 700 million humans had been quietly, accidentally building something in the shared space of the network. A counter-architecture. A human underlanguage. A signal within the signal. They didn't know they were doing it. That was the beauty of it. That was the one thing the Verith's model had not predicted. That human connection, given a medium, would happen without intent or instruction, the way fungi spread through a forest floor, the way birds flock, the way a tune passes from person to person until everyone in a room is humming it without knowing why. Maya looked at Evelyn. "You found it," she said. "The underlanguage." Evelyn's careful composure shifted, barely, just around the edges, but enough. 2 years ago, there were 7 of us at the time, working at integration facilities, watching the data. She paused. The Verith see the bond as a receiver. They built it to receive. They didn't build it to transmit, not in any direction they didn't control. But it is transmitting, in both directions. Has been since the 300th million bonding. That's when the network became dense enough for the emergent signal to be stable. She looked at Maya's arm. "We've been waiting for someone who would understand it on their own, during calibration, without us having to explain it." Maya thought about the 40 seconds, the enormous library, the alien architecture of the Verith consciousness, vast and cold and so certain of its own comprehension that it hadn't noticed what was growing in the walls. "What do you need me to do?" she asked. What they needed her to do was listen. That was the first thing, and it was harder than it sounded. Listening to the underlanguage of 700 million people is not like listening to a conversation. It is like trying to hear a single voice in the sound of a city, except the voice is not a voice. It is a pattern, and the pattern is not saying anything you can translate. It is simply being, enormously and continuously, and with total indifference to whether you understand it or not. Maya spent 3 months listening. She kept her integration authority contact sessions brief and procedural, contributing nothing that wasn't expected of a newly bonded citizen. Her location, her biometrics, the mild traffic of her daily life. She understood from Evelyn and from the other 6 that the Verith's monitoring was comprehensive but not granular. They were reading for aggregate patterns, not individual behavior, in the same way that a satellite can map a city but cannot read the book you're holding. Her individual thoughts were not transmitted, only the ambient signal of her nervous system, only the data she returned to hum. Not literally in the bond. She learned to put something into the underlanguage the way you'd leave a note. Barely a nudge. A small pattern inserted into the signal of her own breathing and heartbeat. nothing that would register as intentional in the Verith's data model. She learned this from the 6 others, who'd been doing it for 2 years, and then she taught it to people she identified at her integration follow-up appointment, and they taught it to others. And the humans who understood what they were doing were few in number, but they were inside the system. The system was everywhere. By the end of the first year, she had 83 people who knew. By the end of the second year, it was 9,000. The underlanguage grew, not as a plan. Plans require communication, and they had communication only in the most careful, invisible increments. It grew the way the unintentional version had grown. Because humans, given a medium, connect. Because even people who didn't know what was happening in the network were contributing to it. Their unconscious, social patterns weaving into the signal. 700 million individual humans dreaming in the same frequency without knowing. They were dreaming together. The Verith published their quarterly integration reports. Participation was up. Network stability was excellent. The Community Health Index showed improved outcomes across all metrics. Humanity was being thoroughly, comprehensively understood. They were not alarmed. That was their fundamental error. Not the bond itself. The bond was a reasonable strategy, and they had used it before on 2 other worlds. The error was the certainty behind it. The belief that a species sufficiently mapped is a species sufficiently known. That understanding the data of a thing is the same as understanding the thing. That 700 million individuals, read carefully enough, tell you everything you need to know about what they'll do when they realize what you've been doing. They did not account for what happens when humans understand they're being listened to and decide to perform. Maya sat in her apartment on a Thursday morning, exactly 3 years and 4 months after her appointment in the White Room, and looked at her arm. The tattoo was visible now, a faint silver-blue tracery under the skin, the same on every bonded person, the quiet mark of integration. She rubbed her thumb across it. The circuit lattice responded to pressure with a warmth that had stopped feeling strange about 6 months in. She thought about her mother, thought about the kitchen table, thought about the word voluntary. She thought about the 9,000 people who knew, and the 200,000 who half knew, and the 700 million who didn't know, but had been building something in the dark of the network. 3 years, piling up their ordinary human noise into a structure that was, if you knew how to look at it, not noise at all. Then she breathed in and she put her signal into the network. Not a nudge, not a note. She put herself into it, all 43 years of herself, childhood, and the loss and the decade of ordinary Saturdays, and the way she felt about rain and every bad decision she'd made that had taught her something, and every moment of irrational stubbornness that had kept her, herself in rooms that wanted her to be otherwise. Shit in the bar and a half of her mother's song. She put in the memory of the waiting room chair, and the way the receptionist's hands had moved, and 7-fingered, across the appointment terminal. She put in the White Room, and the forest photograph, and Evelyn's careful face, and the 40 seconds, and the vast alien library, and the understanding that had arrived in those 40 seconds, like water filling every crack in rock. And 9,000 people, who had been waiting for a signal, responded. Not with the same thing. Each of them put in their own version. Their own 43 years, or 26 or 67. Their own ordinary noise refined into something deliberate. The signature of a mind that knew it was in the system and had decided to use the system. And that combined signal moved through the bond like a sound wave through water, touching every node. And the nodes were 700 million people. And 700 million people, touched by that wave, resonated. They didn't understand it. Most of them would never understand it. But the human underlanguage, which had been building for 3 years in the dark of the network, was not waiting for understanding. It was waiting for amplitude. The Verith network registered the anomaly at 9:47 on a Thursday morning. By their later accounts, extracted from the integration records, parsed by human analysts over the following decade, the initial signal read as a biometric cascade, a synchronized shift in the autonomic nervous systems of a significant proportion of the bonded population, consistent with a collective emotional response. Their models had a category for this: mass grief events, natural disasters, significant political moments. The category called for monitoring and comparison to existing datasets. It took them 11 minutes to understand that the signal was not responding to an external event. It was generating one. The underlanguage, amplified by 9,000 intentional voices, moving through 700 million unconscious resonators, was now visible in the Verath's own data as a structured signal, not the aggregate human noise they had been reading for 3 years, a transmission, a message of a kind. Not in any language the Verath had coded for, because it was not in language. It was in the direct grammar of human nervous systems speaking to each other in a frequency that 3 years of intimate contact had, quietly and without anyone's permission, made shared. What it was not translatable. Not then, and not later, not fully. The human analysts who spent years with the data described it differently. A demonstration, a declaration, an act of collective self-definition, proof of concept. Maya, when she was asked about it in the years that followed, said something simpler. "We showed them what we actually were," she said. "Not the data, us." The Verath withdrew from the integration network within 72 hours. Their stated reason: communicated through the diplomatic channels that had been running parallel to the integration program since the Accord, was a need for recalibration. Further integration would be paused pending analysis. They were very calm about it. They were, by all observed behavior, entirely in control of the situation. 3 months later they proposed a renegotiation of the Accord. The terms they offered were different. The integration program was not part of them. Maya sat in the renegotiation briefing as a technical advisor. She'd been pulled into the diplomatic track after the Thursday event, which was already being called the pulse in the circles that knew about it. She sat at a long table and watched the Verath delegation across from the human negotiators, and she watched the small amber-colored beings with their wide dark eyes and their 7-fingered hands and their extraordinary patience, and she thought, they've recalibrated their model. She thought, they thought they knew us, and in knowing us, they knew what we'd do. She looked at her arm, the circuit lattice, dormant, a ghost in her skin, a thread that ran still into the network which was still running, still bonding new people. The program not cancelled but changed in ways the authorities' press releases had not quite made explicit. The thread that had been a leash was now something harder to name. She rubbed her thumb across the faint silver-blue lines and thought about 40 seconds. The enormous alien library, the certainty of a species that had read 2 other worlds, mapped them completely, dictated them precisely, moved through them like water through rock. What they hadn't read on any of those other worlds, 700 million individuals who had spent 3 years learning to be lonely together. Humans are, at baseline, a species that talks. They talk in language and in music and in gesture, and in the way they arrange their furniture and the routes they walk to work, and the specific frequencies of silence they maintain around people they love. They talk constantly, in every medium available to them, and when you give them a new medium, they will fill it with themselves, before they've finished learning how to use it. The Verath had built a receiver. Humanity had turned it into a telephone, and on a Thursday morning, in the 43rd year of Maya Osi's life, they had called. The renegotiation took 8 months. The new accord was shorter than the original, simpler, more direct, considerably more specificity about what both parties were and were not permitted to do. Maya was not in the room for the signing. She was at home, on her couch, watching the broadcast with a cup of coffee going cold in her hand. She watched the Verath delegation representative place its 7-fingered hand on the document. She watched it look up at the camera, at the people watching, all over the world, bonded and unbonded both, and she watched it hold that gaze for a long moment. She didn't know what the look meant. She suspected it didn't have a translation. She picked up her coffee. It was too cold now, but she drank it anyway. Her phone buzzed. A message from Evelyn, who she had seen in person only twice since the White Room, but who she felt, through the bond, particular low-frequency warmth of someone whose signal you know. The message said, "We did that." Maya looked at her arm. Circuit lattice caught the light from the screen, a faint gleam, a line of silver in her skin. She typed back, "We were always doing it. They just couldn't read it." She set her phone down. On the screen, the signing ceremony was finishing, the diplomats standing, the handshakes and their alien equivalents, the beginning of whatever came next. She thought about her mother. Thought about the kitchen table, the cup of tea, the word voluntary. Thought about what she'd say now, what version of the story she'd tell, starting from the waiting room, starting from the chair that was too comfortable, starting from the faint antiseptic smell, and the seven-fingered hands and the 40 seconds that changed the terms of everything. She thought she'd start with the hum. The bar and a half of the old song, involuntary, just her being herself in a room designed to make her into Data. She thought she'd tell her mother. It was the most human thing I could have done. Outside, the city moved through its Thursday. People bonded and unbonded went about their ordinary lives, and in the substrate of the network, still running, still humming, still carrying the faint signatures of 700 million nervous systems, the underlanguage continued, not as strategy, not as resistance, just as the thing humans do when they're in the same space long enough. They talk to each other. They always had. In every medium, in every frequency, through every structure that was ever built to contain them. You can map a species. You can read its data. You can listen to it with the patience of something that has done this before and believes it knows how. It ends. But you cannot listen to humans without hearing them. And you cannot hear them without being changed by it. That was not in the model. That was never in the model. That was the thing about humans that no model had ever successfully predicted, because it was not a feature. It was not an adaptation or a survival mechanism or a trait that could be cataloged and weighted. It was simpler than that and stranger than that. It was just that they kept being themselves, even when it would have been much easier to stop. Maya O.C. sat on her couch and watched the end of the broadcast and drank her cold coffee, and in the bond, she felt the low warm signatures of 9,000 people who knew, and the wider ocean of 700 million who didn't, and somewhere in the network the signal that they had all built together, without quite meaning to, was still running. Complex, uncodable, stubbornly human, she hummed the bar and a half of the old song. Outside, the city went about its Thursday. The Varath had come a very long way, and read a very great deal, and understood in the end exactly one thing about the species they had tried to map. That understanding was this: they had not understood them at all.